Good morning. Welcome you out this morning to Sunday morning, let's say March 28th. The year's flying by already. It's almost April. Last week we kind of had a pause, kind of an overview of chapter 12, kind of explained how chapter 12, how it fits into the dialogue and how it fits into the flow of Revelation, that it's a pause and it's an explanation of the history of Israel and how this is kind of a slap on the wrist to Israel. Explaining Israel's history to Israelites or to Jewish people is a big deal. They pride themselves in knowing where they came from, and then this is kind of a saying, no, you know the physical aspect, but you don't see the greater picture. I did have just a couple things I wanted to share with you before we get into a couple specifics. I find it interesting that we'll see the great red dragon, which we had talked about, showed up in Psalms, Isaiah, multiple places. Also shows up in other mythologies. It's not crazy to know that there's other like religions, I'll put that out there, that mention a lot of things that are similar. There's a lot of societies that mention a flood. I mean, we know that the Bible is the truth, but we know that this is how Satan works. There's a lot of pagan mythology. The Hydra is a seven-headed dragon of sorts. There's the Leviathan, which was known in multiple pagan and Mesopotamian literature to have multiple heads. There's a lot of mention of great red dragons in Roman mythology and things of that, where we can see they come from the common background or the truth. So these portrayals of the devil as a great red serpent or a serpent with seven heads as a being, it also shows you kind of the political or landscape of the time period, that know that in Revelation, the people who were ruling were Romans. Romans were ruling, forgive me if I'm wrong, Paul was a Roman citizen, John was around there all the time. Roman rule was what was overheading, so him and Christ giving him this vision of a red dragon is not out of nowhere. These are things that he's like, well, understand that this could be in the future who's going to be the culmination of this. This is, we talked about how the seven heads more than likely represents the seven hills of the Roman, of Rome, that it's probably spearheaded by the Roman Catholic Church in the future, and that this is kind of a integration of that, saying, hey, you know who's ruling right now, who has these mentions of dragons and historical contexts. I think it's even Virgil mentions a portrayal of a divine boy who will deliver the world in some of their mythology, and it's kind of integrated into here, or they take parts of it from here. So it could also be a meta-analysis of the Roman culture around and saying, hey, you know who you're a part of. This is, they are analyzing this wrong as well, because they not only knew only Jewish culture, they were required and were encouraged to know a lot about Roman culture and mythology as well. Again, not inherently in Scripture, just kind of an interesting historical context, I think. So take that as you will. Across a couple times in my studies that sometimes some geographical or historical significance. I saw that with the different cities of the different churches in Ephesus as well. So again, just a little bit of insight, a little bit of I think historical context I don't think will hurt us, but it's again not inherently in Scripture. You can't go into the Bible and say that the Romans believed this. That just doesn't usually show up, but I can tell you that there's other analysis. So it's interesting to see that it's could be him bringing in those parts and being like, hey, you know, parts of Rome, saying that these are what they believe, and this is some of the things they believed in the past. Be wary of them for the future. So that was just a quick aside. We're going to talk about the ending part of chapter 12. We've talked about the dragon. We've kind of mentioned the 7 heads, the 10 horns, the 7 crowns. We'll go there again in Daniel chapter 7 today, but let's just very quickly, let's just read those specific portions of Scripture. Let's read Revelation chapter 12 and verse 3. It says, "And there appeared another wonder in heaven. Behold, a great red dragon, having 7 heads and 10 horns and 7 crowns upon his heads." And we see this 7, 10, and 7, the mention of the crowns and the horns, and this is going to be important imagery for when we go to look in Daniel. And another interesting aspect is when we get into chapter 13, just remember the animals, and we'll talk about it a little bit more. So let's very quickly, we'll turn to Daniel chapter 7, and we'll see a little bit more extrapolation of these creatures and what these possibly represent. Again, I can't tell you for sure that each one of these represents a certain time period or a certain, how can I say, like a ruling power in the world, but it's more than likely that they do. They don't say this one's Rome and this one's Alexander and this one's, it doesn't say that in the Bible. So I can't say 100% sure that that's what this means. All I can tell you is that it's mentioned in multiple places and mentioned and saying, hey, we want to draw back to Daniel. We've seen that already in chapter 11 where it was referencing back to Daniel. So the fact that the chapter 12 is referencing back to Daniel should not surprise you. Should not come as that there's more here. They're very interlinked because if you remember, Daniel got a lot more than he asked for in these chapters, a lot more than he was expecting to get, a lot more insight. So we'll talk and see a little bit about this just so I can show you that these same beasts and the amount of heads and crowns all kind of show up again, just so I can show you that they do interlink a little bit more. Daniel chapter 7 verse 1, it says, "In the first year of Belshazzar, king of Babylon, Daniel had a dream and visions of his head upon his bed. Then he wrote the dream and told the sum of the matters. Daniel spake and said, I saw my vision by night, and behold, the 4 winds of the heavens strove upon the great sea. And the 4 beasts came up from the sea, diverse from one another. And the first was like a lion." So we see the lion first, "and he had eagle's wings, and I beheld the wings thereof were plucked, and from it was lifted up from the earth, and I made stand upon the feet as a man, and the man's heart was given to it." So we see a lion with eagle's wings with 1 head. Right? So a lion with 1 head. So just keep that in mind. In verse 5 it says, "And beheld another beast, a second like unto a bear, and it raised up itself on one side, and it had 3 ribs in the mouth of it, between the teeth of it. And they said unto it, Arise, devour much flesh. And this I beheld, and lo another," so we see a bear with 1 head. In verse 6 it says, "And I beheld, lo another, like a leopard, which had upon the back of it 4 wings of a fowl, and the beast also had 4 heads, and dominion was given unto it." So we see a leopard with 4 heads. And then we see in verse 7, "And I saw in the night visions, behold, a fourth beast, dreadful and terrible, and strong exceedingly, and it had great iron teeth, and devoured and brake it in pieces, and stamped the residue with the feet of it, and they're diverse from all the beasts that were before it, and it had 10 horns. So we see the lion had 1 head, the bear had 1 head, the leopard had 4 heads, so that's 1, 1, 4, that's 6, plus this 4th one which has 1 head, so that's 7 heads and 10 horns. Hopefully that's not drawing too far from the beast that is mentioned in Revelation. We see 7 heads, 10 horns, and then it mentions 7 crowns, and we'll talk a little bit about that in the future. And we see in verse 8, which is going to come, I think, more into fruition in chapter 13, it says, "I considered the horns, and behold, there came up among them another little horn, before whom there were 3 of the first horns plucked up by the roots, and behold, in this horn were eyes like the eyes of man, and a mouth speaking great things." So we see in Daniel this mention, or this view of prophecy to him. We see in Daniel this thing of things coming before him. Again, it doesn't say dogmatically that this is the Alexander Empire, this is the Roman Empire, this is that but from history we can kind of take these things and say these are kind of alliterate ruling powers that are going to oppress the Jewish people or oppress the world coming. The only problem I have with a lot of those interpretations is they give the fourth beast, they assign someone to the fourth beast. A lot of them assign someone to the fourth beast. We don't know who the fourth beast is. The fourth beast is yet to come, or is possibly starting now, depending on how you feel about current events. We have this enigma happening, and I don't want to spend too much time saying that this one's Roman, this one's Alexander, this one's Nero, this one's... I don't feel like that's super beneficial, at least to me. There's lots of studies, so I'd encourage you to look it up if that's what you want to learn. I just wanted to show you that in Daniel, it mentions these four creatures that lines up with the heads of the creature in Revelation. That this is extremely prophetic from Daniel to then show in Revelation how this comes to fruition. So my question to you is, what nationality was Daniel? Easy question. Yes, he was. That's easy. So, another point I'm going to hammer home is when these things start getting mentioned in Revelation, when these creatures having this certain amount of heads and having the beasts and these things going, I know what these are. Especially in chapter 13, we're going to see these beasts mentioned again. They would know to go back to Daniel. So again, another driving force of Revelation is to drive you to the Bible. That's, I think, one of the most important things that's been taught for me as we've come forth into, from the beginning of Revelation until now. It drives you to other portions of Scripture. And it's very, I wouldn't say it's subtle, it's very pointed. It needs you to have context. It needs you to have the historical or the significance of the passage for you to truthfully understand what's being said. It needs you to go back and know the historical roots. It's trusting on prior knowledge, which I find very interesting. Revelation is a book unlike a lot of others in the Bible. It requires you to know what comes before it. It references almost the entire of history before it. It's making you dive and say, I don't understand this. Or, again, we don't understand this, but the Jewish people would understand it inherently because this is what they were brought up to learn. They would know this. They would go, oh yeah, that's Daniel. Oh yeah, the last 5 chapters have included something, or the last 3 chapters, have been included something with Daniel, and the next one will include something with Daniel again. Maybe we should read more of Daniel. That's kind of, an unwritten rule, or they should be like, oh man, maybe I should go back and understand. Again, another thing that's very interesting to see about this is, and I'm going to draw this little comparison here, is Revelation references Daniel, which is referencing Jeremiah. This is a 3-tiered version. And we see in Daniel chapter, I believe 12 or 11, where he says he was reading the words of Jeremiah, and this is where he started to get these things. So Revelation is inherently a book saying you need to be ingrained in the Scriptures to understand. You are not just going to read Revelation and understand it. And I think that that's really important. That's what I believe one of the biggest pushes of Revelation, or why Revelation exists, is because it's forcing you to discern Scripture with Scripture. This is something that I've said from the beginning, but these, as we've gotten deeper into it, it has like 3 layers of, I need you to understand the history, or I want you to understand the context. I need you to go back to Exodus. I need you to go back to Daniel. I need you to go back to Leviticus and look at the Levitical priesthood. I need you to know about Christ. I need you to go back to Joseph and read about him and the sun and the moon, and how his dream is inherently bound to this chapter. This chapter requires so much historical significance and historical context that if you knew nothing of Jewish culture or nothing from the rest of the Bible, Revelation chapter 12 would be hard for you to make sense of. If we did not have the rest of the Bible, Revelation 12 would be impossible, I think, to understand truthfully all the way. So that's something that I think is beautiful about Revelation, is it was made for the churches, right? This was one of the first historically this was one of the first historically divided books of the Bible. If you look, this is the first one given to the churches for them to read aloud and study, which in turn made them turn to the Bible, which in turn made them open the scriptures and be like, if I'm unfamiliar with this passage, I need to go and look. Revelation is driving you to the Bible, and that's what I think a lot of people get wrong, or a lot of interpretations. Again, I do a lot of research, I do a lot of Googling, I do a lot of trying to cross-reference things, and I come up with a lot of stuff that when I finish reading, go, that was entirely not even close. At least from what it's not even in line with Scripture. There's people reaching for things that don't even make sense, and it's because they're not using Scripture. It's because they're not taking it in the historical context of the Bible. They're not taking the Bible for what it's worth. Yes, Don, go ahead.
Looking out real quickly. So Daniel, go back to Daniel for a second. On a historical basis. Nebuchadnezzar's world empire, Nebuchadnezzar was gone. He's in the Medo-Persian Empire at that point. Alexander's empire was on 330 BC. And then the Roman Empire was supposed to come. So part of this is past, present, and future.
So it's even ingrained. Don was saying that this was in past, present, and future from Nebuchadnezzar, the Mesopotamian Empire into the Roman Empire, so that he was seeing what is, what is, and what is to come. Essentially, was what Don was saying, that this is him in taking this and looking at it and saying, this is what's part of our history and where we're moving towards. Not only what was our immediate past, but what is going to be our far and distant future. What we're not looking forward to, but what we're warned against, and what we should be looking for, of that these things are going to happen. Again, like I was saying, it's important if you do any sort of research, and if you want to look into how these line up with different empires, it's great. There's a lot of them that make a lot of sense, that they line up very, very well. I didn't find it super effectual for me to learn those things, just because it gets into a lot of conjecture. Because as soon as that fourth beast hits, a lot of people are like, and it was this guy. I'm like, well, we don't know who it is. You can't say that. So then it makes me question the other three that they said before. It makes me go, well, do you actually know? And the answer is no, they don't actually know. They can kind of say that they know and say, well, by history and things like that. It's pushing you to know that these things were of importance, that these powers were of importance. It's using the same signs and metaphors that Revelation 12 is using to go back to their history. And I'll show you that these kind of line up with each other in chapter 13 when we get there. Just know that chapter 13 verse 1 says in it, the land of the sea, and beast rise up out of the sea, having 7 heads and 10 horns, and upon his horns 10 crowns, and upon his heads the name of blasphemy. This is a little bit different because this one has 10 crowns as the other one had 7 crowns, but we see that there's a lot of similarities between the beasts and what they do, and it'll even go forth into naming these creatures in the future, but I'm not quite there yet. I wanted to cover the rest of chapter 12, but know that I'm not just giving you conjecture. These are things to come in the future that I'll hold you to, and you will be required to know, otherwise you'll get a failing grade for the class. We see this beautiful callback to Daniel of making him realize that you have to be versed in the scripture to understand these alliterations. If you did not understand that the woman is with the clothed, I'm sorry, let me make sure I get this right. The woman clothed with the sun and the moon under her feet, and her head a crown of 12 stars. You would not get the correct answer that this is Israel. You would get the Roman Catholic answer of that this is Mary. If you did not say that these things, if you weren't given or the historical context, you would not know the reasons why. Yes, Don?
So you think of the imagery of the Joseph's dream, the sun, the moon, and the stars. And you think about, so that would be definitely obvious to Hebrews if they would remember that.
Yeah. So that this is that the imagery of Joseph's dream is going to be inherent to the understanding of this, to set this up so they know their history. And that is something that we've seen throughout Scripture. I hope that's not too much of a stretch. There's portions of Scripture we could turn to where they say that we be of Abraham's seed, or they know their past. They claim to know and understand where they came from, but they will refuse to see the ramifications or the spiritual meaning of their history, or they fail to see the danger in front of them. So as we're continuing on here, we've seen that the lion, the bear, the leopard, and then the fourth beast with the 10 horns, we see that this kind of lines up in chapter 13, and we'll just kind of read the very beginning of this. We've kind of talked about the last of chapter 12 last week, where she was delivered and that the dragon was wroth, and that the war was being made with them. And now it kind of pivots to this another aspect. And remember that we mentioned the little horn. We'll talk a little bit more about that in the future as we go forth. But we see this very first two verses, and I kind of wanted to cover this as like the final point today. And it says, "And upon the sand of the sea, and I saw a beast rise up out of the sea." And again, we're in Revelation chapter 13. "Having 7 heads and 10 horns, and upon his horns 10 crowns, and upon his heads the name of blasphemy. And the beast which I saw was like unto a leopard, and his feet were as the feet of a bear, and his mouth as the mouth of a lion. And the dragon gave him power, and his seat and great authority." So interesting, all of them combined. Hopefully that's not too much of a stretch. An interesting fact about these is, and this is kind of how another reason that I can very dogmatically say that Revelation is a future book, and that there's things that were going to happen, and we don't see that fourth beast head because it's not defined. How are these named? How are that these things happened in the past? So that's my one little thing. Yet they're named in reverse from Daniel. The leopard was the last one to be mentioned in Daniel, and now it's the first one, because John is seeing this from the past. John is seeing these things that have come already, and that the fourth beast is yet to come. That's why I personally believe anybody who names who the fourth beast is, they don't know what they're talking about, because that's not mentioned. So it's kind of interesting that he sees these in reverse here. He says, "I see a leopard, the bear, and then the lion." And if you remember in Daniel, it goes lion, bear, leopard. Just an interesting little, I think, snippet of saying that John sees these in reverse order because those had happened already, or in the midst of it, at the tail end of it, and now the rest is yet to come. He sees those in reverse order, signifying the past. I think that's an interesting little snippet of how it's laid out, and I think it's laid out on purpose. I don't think it was laid out in that way on accident. I think it was saying that, oh no, I see the leopard, which would have been the most historical one closest to us, and then the bear, and then the lion, and that's why it's mentioned that way, which I think is a very interesting specific reason that's laid that way. So we see this beast set up in Daniel. We see the significance of the beast. Now, I want you to understand that because it's not 4 separate beasts, doesn't mean that they're not compatible. Right? I don't want you to say that because it's not a lion with one head with wings as an eagle and a bear with ribs in his mouth, that, oh, you can't compare these are different. These are all symbols. This is all methodology. So my question to you would say the beast, which is the leopard and the bear in his mouth, what does that mean? And the dragon gave him power and his seat and great authority. What does that show you? Is if you're taking this in a metaphorical sense or a symbol or a signs sense of saying that this means something else, what does that show you from this aspect? It's kind of a little bit of a reach to probably jump from that question. This is a very my dad question, so I apologize in advance. You do have the answer? What does it show you?
It shows you that Satan is in control of the worldly kingdoms. He was with the lion, the bear, and the leopard. He's in complete control. It's Satan. He's the prince of power here.
Yeah, and it says that especially right then, the dragon gave him power and a seat great authority at the end of chapter 2. My dad was saying that it showed that he was in control of everything, of this aspect of the earthly powers, of the political spectrum of these things, that Satan knew what he was doing. I think what this also shows is that it's a person who's going to have aspects of every one of those empires. I think it's a person who's going to have seeds or at least roots from every bit of these things that showed great power in the past. This is going to show a person who is well versed in historical and current political climates. This is going to show a person who is very capable of this position. All these powerful creatures who were given power and showed this great ruling aspect. He's going to have aspects of every single one of them. He's going to be those combined, essentially. And I think that should scare you, of someone who is going to be as powerful as any of the greatest powers in history is going to be put into place. And very well regarded, and it's going to be Satan's tool, literally. He's going to say, hey, I gave you this power. So knowing that there's a thing coming or starting that will have this power given into him by Satan, that has this roots in all these historical great dynasties, you could say, that will show you that this is what's to come. Something that's regarded as powerful, and something that will show you is a great figurehead for the world, I'll say that, and a great and powerful figurehead of these people we look back who have done terrible things in the world, and we idolize them because of their ability to mobilize people, is going to not hold a candle to what's about to come. This person will make those other people look pale in comparison. It will show him as an amazing figurehead that will be regarded by the whole world, and we'll see that as we go forth. And who at this point has been a friend to Israel. I mean, if we can go back and read, and we'll get some of the more context of how he's trying to save them, and it looks like a friend, and then he's immediately going to turn into a huge enemy. So we'll get forth into that a little bit more in chapter 13. Again, I hope chapter 12 is a little more clear to you from the time before. We talked a lot about the days, the timings in Daniel, and I didn't want to get bogged down too much into the numbers. So I think moving on into chapter 13, unless there's something that you can't explain or something that you didn't understand, I'll make sure that I try to go back and cover it a little more. But showing that 12 is a historical view of Israel and who they are, and that this is kind of a slap on the wrist of saying that you don't understand who you are in the grand scheme. That this is a great representation of driving you to the scriptures, of saying, like, if you don't understand these intricacies, you're not going to understand the greater view. And I think that has been the downfall of many people who've tried to interpret Revelation chapter 12 and taking these things out of context, and they're just like, oh, well, it's this person, and this is definitely Mary, and you just like, no, it's very clearly not. If you know and search the scriptures, it's revealed to you. Mr. Stewart, if you don't mind closing us in prayer this morning.
Father, we thank you for the book of the Bible. We praise you. Thank you for this book we're reading.